Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. My name's Colin. I am president of Foxhire, employer of record service here in the U.S., and I've got two people from my team, Jamie Henry, our director of operations, and Jessica Arby, our director of HR, here to talk about a really important topic, 1099 versus W-2. We talk about this a lot on our social media, and I know it's a big thing specifically in healthcare. So there's been a burgeoning little battle going on between healthcare gig platforms and traditional staffing firms around what is a 1099 and what is a W-2. So I'm excited to have these two join. I guess I'll kick off the questions with Jamie or Jess, whoever wants to start. Do you feel like the scrutiny around 1099 and W-2 has been growing recently?
Yes,
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
No, I think, we've seen it come up a lot where, they're really starting to crack down on it based on, changes that we've seen in the law and things like that that are coming up here.
And when you say crack down and you say they, who is they? Like when you say they're cracking down, who is they?
So the Department of Labor is what's like kind of at the forefront right now as far as the changes that they're making. So coming March 11th this year is when that new rule will go into effect that kind of make some changes to, the way that the way that they look at 1099s versus W-2s and how you quantify them as an actual employee or not. And, it's really potentially going to affect the staffing industry at large, I think.
Yeah. So Department of Labor, which is interesting because a lot of people, when I talk to either recruiting agencies or other people in the staffing market, when you mention 1099 versus W-2, they always want to jump to it's a tax thing, like that. It's an IRS or a tax thing, which is true. They have a position on 1099 versus W-2 as well, but that's not necessarily who's actually pushing regulation here. So I think it might be helpful to people that may not be familiar with this topic to just explain the differences between W-2 and 1099, just the basic standards that maybe either or IRS or DOL have for that. So what is a 1099 and what is a W-2, guys? What are they?
Right. So 1099 is an independent contractor. The IRS identifies them based on the type of relationship that, is between the worker and the, company. Also what kind of financial control is involved. What kind of behavioral control is involved. How does that affect the way that the work is done or where the work is done or, that kind of thing. Financial control has to do with like who handles the expenses and how does that person get paid and, all that kind of stuff. So
Jess, it even comes down to training too, right? There's a training aspect of it, right? Like, so theoretically, an independent contractor wouldn't receive training or education or orientation per se, right? Whereas an employee would.
Yep, and I'd say that's under the relationship. So, and so IRS has those three factors, while the Department of Labor also, scrutinizes how we look at a 1099, right? So they have an economic reality test, which is 5 factors. And the 5 factors are the amount of skill. So like, that's what you're talking about, Jamie, that part that's required for the work, the degree of permanence of the working relationship, and then also whether the work is part of an integrated unit of production. There are also 2 other parts to that carry more weight. So the nature and degree of control of the work, and then also the worker's opportunity for profit and loss. So that financial control part. So they're similar, but kind of different too, how they look at it. But, we try to, when we are looking at them as far as how we test, to determine if, for role, it could be a 1099. Most of the time it's going to be a W-2. I mean, it's pretty hard to qualify for a 1099. So, you know, when we're looking through that testing to see like, does this role qualify? You know, we go through those types of questions and then we would determine, you know, yes or no. And most of the time, you know, it ends up being recommended as a W-2.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think for me, right, as somebody we're not operating in the gray area at all, right? Like we do very little 1099s at all,
Right.
if any, truly.
Mhm.
But a lot of people in the staffing market do leverage the 1099 model a lot. And
Yep.
if I were one of them, I would probably be more concerned about the DOL shining the light on me than the IRS. Would I be right in thinking that?
I agree with that.
And why would that be? Like, why would the DOL be more concerning to you versus the IRS?
Well, with the Department of Labor, there are so many facets to if you're misqualifying or misclassifying the worker as a 1099 and they should be a W-2. If you end up getting caught, say 2 years down the road, you know, you're going through an audit investigation, it's found that you've done something incorrectly, they're going to backdate all that information, and it's not just going to be the back pay to the workers. You know, you're subject to making sure that they're paid minimum wage and that they're paid overtime. So all of that is due to the worker. Sometimes there are you know, additional like what's it called when you have interest. That's it.
Yeah, interest on the monies that you
Interest on,
didn't pay. Yeah.
right. And then also penalties, fines, things like that. But on top of that, you know, you'll also be on the hook as far as, you know, say if you did that wrong, then you're also looking at, you know, say you put the information in correctly when you filed your workers' comp premiums for the year. You've got to go back and fix that. You know, that's a state requirement. It's a government thing. So there's a lot of things. When you misclassify, it kind of like trickles back to all of those errors in all of the other areas. So yeah, like state workers' comp rules, unemployment is affected. You know, DOL may report it back to IRS too. So then you're on the hook for the, you know,
Got a
the issue.
second person coming after you. Yeah.
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 So there's a
Yeah.
lot.
There was a recent healthcare example. It actually was one of the larger ones, but dated back to early last year, early 2023. And when the DOL got involved, it ended up costing the client, so not the agency, but the client, 19 million. And you're right, Jess, that was collective in terms of back pay. Benefits that they should have received because they were misclassified as 1099 instead of W-2. There were fines associated with not having appropriately cataloged employees' time. So like they ended up having fines for not tracking time because they were treating them as 1099, right? So they weren't appropriately collecting timesheets. And then there were a couple other factors in there as well, such as like not providing appropriate protections against harassment from patients. Because they were treating them as independent contractors, but in fact, they were misclassified, should have been employees, and as such were owed protections by their employer that weren't provided. So you're right, it's all those different ways, right? All those little tendrils that sneak out from that misclassification when we choose to treat somebody as an independent contractor instead of appropriately treating them as an employee.
So the Department of Labor, as to why they're so much more concerning to me, it sounds like, is they're there to protect the employees, not necessarily just get their tax money, right? IRS is there to get their tax money, and you're going to pay the taxes, right? Sure. But only really if they audit you, and that's not very common. But the DOL, you can have complaints to the DOL. People can shine the light on you outside of your organization from multiple arenas, not just your employees, but your competitors. In this case that we're talking about with the gig platforms versus the staffing firms, like there's a lot of different pathways to be getting into the buzzsaw of the Department of Labor, which you want to avoid. And I think that's a very big distinction for a lot of people in the staffing market to understand. The 1099 W-2 thing is just not about, it's not just about taxes. It is about taxes, but it's more so about now in current market DOL and how they might prosecute against you if you're found to have mistreated employees or misclassified them to avoid these certain costs that they would be afforded if they were W-2. But that's like a very big thing for people to understand because like that's the basis of this whole thing. I don't think a lot of people understand that. And to your point, Jamie, about the agency that you mentioned, $19 million also affects the client organization, which that's a major, major reason why I think a lot of people are looking at this now is the clients are seeing they're at risk.
Right, absolutely. And they go with these gig platforms, with 1099s in general and gig platforms specifically to minimize financial impact of staffing, right?
Right.
So they're trying to go for that lower cost model, trying to go for, more of a PRN shift coverage versus, a specified contract period. And so, they're doing these things to try to save money. And here in the long run, it's actually leading to a lot of additional costs because it's not being handled appropriately. So
yeah, exactly. And so that's where a lot of the pressure is coming from too, as well. Not just the DOL, but now clients notice that they're at risk, so they're putting pressure on their vendors.
absolutely. Right. And so much so, Colin, that specific to healthcare, we're seeing it come up in state agency licensing. So now a lot of these state agency license laws are requiring that agencies only place as W-2 placements for their clients. And you have to submit your contracts to the state. So it's, they are actually reviewing. And there was a recent case in Illinois that's actually how it was caught. So an agency in Illinois ordered to pay $140,000 in back pay because they had classified nurses, RNs and LPNs, as well as CNAs as 1099s instead of W-2s.
Yes. So if most firms know, or at least there's some talk, right? If you're in the healthcare staffing industry, there's some talk about this this potentially happening. 1099 W-2, like, this is out there for most people. Most people in the staffing industry know. So why did the gig platform specifically go with the 1099 model? Like, why do they start with that when they know it might put them at jeopardy?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, a lot of it is the margins, right? Like it's much easier to
Yes.
have, a lower bill rate with a higher margin when you're doing, an independent contractor. And Jess, you can probably speak a little more clearly as to why that is. I know there's a lot less involved with supporting an independent contractor than a W-2.
Right. I mean, they're not an employee, So, I mean, if they're truly an independent contractor, they are not qualified for any of those employee entitlements. So, it's like HR is no longer part of the picture when they're truly an independent contractor. So that's why it's, something that has to be really scrutinized. Yeah.
Yeah. So with those margins, what these gig platforms are able to do with the 1099 model is have a two-sided advantage, right? Because you're selling, as a staffing firm, you're selling two parties, right? You're selling a candidate and you're selling a client. You're selling a candidate on this job. You're selling the client on the fact that they can provide candidates. And so there's two sides of that equation, dollars-wise, that they can now have an advantage. Because there's a larger margin between the bill rate and the pay rate, they can actually increase the pay rate to the candidate, attracting more workers, having more volume on their platform of candidates willing to take jobs, and they can lower their bill rate, right, to the client and say, hey, it's lower prices, more candidates, right, and still make a good margin, equal to or better than their competition. So they're having this dual side advantage because they have some more room between their costs and their bill rate. So that's why they start that way. And they're following a model similar to other gig platforms that exist. And they're trying to establish a similar position to Uber, Lyft, and the other gig platforms out there that have been able to lobby the government and establish themselves as independent contractor platforms. All right. And I think that's why that fifth point on the test you mentioned from the Department of Labor was specifically geared towards that, which is the contractor's ability for profit or loss, right? So if you think about just like in the context of Uber, they got to pay for gas, car insurance, car maintenance, et cetera. They have an opportunity for loss, right? But also for profit. If they run their business, i.e. leverage the platform to take gigs effectively enough to where they can cover their costs, right? And that can apply to like other gig platforms as well, where you might need like equipment or raw materials or goods or whatever to service your customer. And you're really just using the marketplace that the gig platforms establish to find those customers, right? And that's really where the gig platforms like Uber and Lyft have establish their position, like, okay, this is why it's 1099. But the healthcare workers, that does not exist. That's not
Right.
like, it doesn't really work that way for them, and also for other reasons, right? Like they operate under orders, and so therefore the
Correct.
control aspect is extremely clear, to where you really can't be a 1099 as a healthcare worker, because you really don't meet any aspects of that test, but at minimum those two.
Correct. Yep. Those are the two big ones, Colin. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So knowing this, if I'm a staffing firm, and I'm a big staffing firm, like one of the biggest ones out there, let's just say like Maxim Healthcare or AMN or whatever, this is a threat to my business.
Yes.
This is a major threat to my business. And from their perspective, the staffing firms are saying they're not following the rules, and they're establishing unfair advantages over the other competitors in the market via the 1099 model. So that's why they're like, hey, what's going on, right? Like this doesn't make sense. And a lot of the gig platforms drove extreme high levels of growth through COVID, and by effectively competing against those traditional staffing models, not just because their technology is good, but also because their pricing is much better. So given all that, we had this conversion of both two groups, the healthcare staffing firms and the gig platforms sort of position themselves as adversaries now, even though some of the healthcare staffing firms are coming out with technology to sort of compete with that. It's just pretty clear that the 1099 model isn't currently legal. And so it started a lobbying competition. All right, so there's sort of a series of events that took place that got us to this point. And it sort of started with the Biden administration issuing a rollback of the Trump era independent contractor regulations. So Trump had rolled it back, not him specifically, but his administration pushed forward legislation that made it a little bit easier to classify people as 1099s. Outside of California, which has the AB5 law, everybody else had pretty wide-ranging capabilities to do 1099s comparative to the Biden's administration's new law that came out when Biden took office. And when that came out, you saw an increase in prosecution and enforcement of these regulations. So all the way up through last year at this time is when that $19 million lawsuit was finalized.
Right.
And from there, it was a flurry of actions by both staffing firms and 1099 model gig platforms, voicing their opinions to the powers that be. And it started with a letter from 30, or a coalition, 30 staffing firms joined forces and wrote a letter to the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division, in August of 2023. So they saw this lawsuit happen. They said, okay, we need to keep this going. We want to protect our businesses. So some of the top healthcare staffing firms in the world wrote this letter. It was co-signed by IntelliCare, Gale Healthcare, ConnectRN, and ShiftMed, which I think are gig platforms in and of themselves.
They are.
All, right?
Yeah.
So
yep, they are. But they offer the W-2 model. That's right.
Yeah, we're doing it the right way. You know, we want everybody to do it the right way. But then also much more traditional staffing firms like AMN, Adventis, who are some of the big guys on this, Trusted Health, Travel Nurse Across America, like some of the more traditional healthcare staffing firms were like, we agree. Department of Labor, do something about this, right? Shortly after that, a response from a law firm that represents the gig platform said, no, that, this is why they're wrong. This is why we should still have 1099 capabilities. We're just a marketplace. We're not an employer. We're just a marketplace for people to find shifts. And that's what our technology does. We're not an employer, et cetera. But that's not really true, because they are providing benefits if you look at a lot of their websites and things like that, plus the control and all the other aspects we mentioned. So those things took place. And there was multiple responses after that where they sort of went at each other. And then finally, the Department of Labor said, hey, new rule. Here's the new rule, the 5-point test, Jess, you started with earlier, right? That's the new rule from the Department of Labor that came out in the last couple of months. And it's supposed to settle this for, from here on out. And ultimately, the responses from a lot of the gig platforms when that rule came out was, well, this doesn't affect our business. It's basically the same as before or more ambiguous than before. So we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And it's really not created mass movement yet. But what you can see is they're setting themselves up, that those new tests are setting themselves up to be able to enforce it, right? Enforce more effectively. And so I think, I don't know if you guys would agree, but I guess I'll ask, has there been more or less action from a legal perspective on the 1099 W-2 front in the last, let's just call it 6 months? Just anecdotally, what would you guys say?
I mean, I think we're seeing it more and more in the media, whether it's because it's had attention and therefore it's staying at the forefront. I can't say for sure. I will tell you, both the American Staffing Association and Staffing Industry Analysts have been talking about it quite a bit. And I know perspectives there are for healthcare, that the thought process is, this actually confirms W-2 is the appropriate model. So, very much still under hyper focus. And I know what we are hearing is more and more requests from clients to convert placements that had previously been 1099 to W-2 in order to come into what they perceive to be compliance, before there's any further scrutiny. So,
Yeah.
And why would clients care about it, right? Like, why would clients care? Why are they the pressure point?
That's what I was thinking about too, as far as like, the whole client movement being probably really what's going to push this more than the law change, because there's a lot of ways to interpret the law. But I think whenever a client just sets their focus as like, this is what we're doing, then we need all of our, vendors that we work with to comply with it, or they're not going to work with us, So I think that there may be some that, ignore it, but then there will be a lot that are, just going to follow that path and want to make sure that we're doing it the correct way according to what we think and what our attorneys think, and, which would be to, switch all those 1099s over to W-2s.
Yeah. And when
and
a big hospital system does that, puts a lot of pressure on you as a vendor if you want to hit your numbers.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right. Absolutely. And just that the pressure from the clients is coming largely from the DOL's perspective on co-employment, right? It's because the risk doesn't necessarily just lie with the agency if there's non-compliance, right? Like the work site, that the host employer.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I mean, we
could be
as the staffing agency, I mean, you have some control over that worker, but when the client also has control over the worker in other ways, there is by nature, joint employment happening to where there's, a possibility of the client's the one that's pulled in, the agency may be the one that's pulled in, they both may be pulled in. You just don't know until you get there.
Yeah, exactly. So if 2 or 3 or 4 of these big healthcare systems say, hey, like, we are not going to work with you unless you do W-2. If I'm a CEO of a gig platform, my hands are forced. I have to figure it out, or else I'm losing a large portion of my revenue. And that's really what's going to drive it. It's honestly, the numbers are going to speak for the decision-making here. It's maybe not people trying to be good boys and girls, but trying to just make sure they don't lose their customers.
Stay in business.
Right. Especially as some of these other gig platforms do move towards that, right? And we're seeing that. We're seeing several of them do that and really be very, vocal about the changes that they've made and be proud of the work they've done to do that. So I think more and more we're going to see those gig platforms that have the W-2 option taking on some of those bigger clients.
Yep. Yeah, and it's also other third parties as well are driving the change too, because some of the organizations that signed this letter, like AMN as an example, operate MSP programs. And so if you want to sell to customers that use AMN, because AMN is sort of holds the keys to the kingdom to all those customers, you got to offer W-2 or you can't service these customers, right?
Yes.
So there's other pressure, not just from the clients, but from the third-party administrating organizations like MSPs and VMSs that you also have to comply with. So there's like mounting pressure from every angle, especially at the highest level, at the biggest health systems, right? If you're in a lower level, like in long-term care, skilled nursing, et cetera, you could still find some success there, which I think some of the smaller Gig platforms might still be able to service there and maybe fly under the radar for a little bit longer. But over time, I think all of the industry is going to force that W-2 mindset. And it's just not going to be possible to operate 1099 maybe over the next, I don't know, 3 to 5 years. We'll see the change happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that timeline sounds about right. I mean, it's definitely gaining momentum.
Yeah. I mean, what would your predictions be for the next 2 to 3 years? You think people will comply, or do you think it's going to be more lobbying? Do you think there's going to be more fines? All of the above? What do you think?
All of the above, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to expect the lobbying. It's just part of what happens, right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing the increased fines already, so we know that that's going to continue. But I think the more we see the fines, the more we're also going to see compliance too. So,
Right. So the idea that another gig platform might pop up quickly is sort of limited given the requirement they would have to hit W-2 as a starting point. Whereas it's much easier to start a gig platform if you're doing the 1099 as a starting point. So similar to many industries, the increase of regulation increases the barrier to entry. So as a silver lining to these gig platforms, if you do make the switch, you entered the game before the walls became too high. And now you're sort of protected by this regulation, and the barriers to entry for new gig platforms to establish themselves is going to be much higher.
right,
Yeah, that's a good
right,
point.
absolutely, yeah,
Because you're not going to be able to just say, okay, I can employ in all 50 states tomorrow, like a lot of these gig platforms did with the 1099 rules. 1099, you can theoretically just say, all right, across the board, as long as I have an entity in that state, I can do business in that state. But employing in every state is way different.
correct.
Yeah.
So those gig platforms will have their work cut out for them, though, if the goal is to convert to that W-2 model, right? So that'll be the next race: is how quickly can they convert over to W-2?
And how do they do it, right? They do it themselves. Do they
Right.
partner with an employer of
Through a
record?
partner,
Which
yep.
that's happening.
Mhm.
What ways can they explore doing so that aren't going to be super disruptive? Because going back all the way to the top, the reason they did this is because they can have a double-sided advantage on the pay rate and the bill rate, right?
Right.
So they're going to have to increase their bill rate or decrease their pay rates, or both.
Both,
To
right,
enable
right.
themselves to achieve enough margin to be successful. And that's going to be a totally different problem they're going to have to solve for, because we already know there's mounting pressure from CFOs at hospital systems to decrease the reliance on travelers and staffing firms, but also decrease bill rates because they got heavily affected by the rate surges during COVID.
Right, right. It's reduced that contingent spend period. That's right.
Yeah. The light got shown on the contingent spend during COVID and the bill rates. I mean, it was in the public forum how much these rates, like everybody was talking about, not just staffing industry people, the crazy amounts of money these nurses were being paid or billed for.
Right. But as there's continued competition in that space, right? Because we know we have a shortage of qualified personnel to service the healthcare industry.
True.
And now we're seeing states implementing all of these mandated ratios. The demand's still going to be there. There's still going to, a lot of that fix is still going to have to come from contingent staff. So, there's still fantastic opportunity there if they can get the mix right, in terms of the bill rate, the pay rate, and how it's being delivered.
Right. Well, I'm excited to see what happens. It's definitely been an interesting time. It's not been status quo at all the last 3 to 5 years. So when you think about disruption, this is one of the industries that got absolutely disrupted by technology, the gig economy, COVID, all the things. So very dynamic space. So excited to see what happens. We hope you found this helpful, and we look forward to another episode next week. Have a great day, everybody.